Ross, this is really sending people into a spin this morning. What are the business implications here?
Well, they're pretty significant because do consider that Facebook is one of the key sources of news that Australians have right now. And as you've just heard, New South Wales Fire and Rescue, we've heard about the Bureau of Meteorology, but there's other things also that people are turning to Facebook in particular. Now, say, for example, the ACCC, when it put out a statement last year in regards to potential bans from these organisations, and as this legislation was being mooted, it at that stage quoted the University of Canberra's 2020 Digital News Report. It said that 39% of Australians use Facebook for general news, but this is the important one. 49% of Australians actually use Facebook to gain news about COVID. Now, given the fact that you've got a pandemic, given the fact that that is a public health situation, it is quite clear and very important that you have got this number of people. Now, we also know that around 17 million Australians will use Facebook on a monthly basis. And so, you know, you can see the importance of it. So to have this ban, literally what it would seem to be as a bargaining chip right now with the government as this legislation goes through, really is, if you like, a bit of a standoff with the government.
Look, Josh Frydenberg was pretty calm this morning. He was confident that we could get over this. I mean, others, like Andrew Bragg, who chaired the committee, says, well, Facebook's just being a corporate bully. And this is not the first time it has made threats of withdrawal from Australia, but this is a pretty significant step forward, isn't it?
Oh, well, it really is to have this ban on news sources right now. And you do get the sense that once this legislation goes through, that Facebook will again relook at Australia and see exactly what its role will be in the dissemination of news. Now, just a small thing, if you go back over history, a year or so ago when the e-Safety Commissioner was being introduced in Australia, similar threats were made. In fact, it's the Communications Minister Paul Fletcher who had told me that only a couple of weeks ago on Business Weekend. But the second thing also is if you go back to when GST was introduced onto Australian goods and services, remember at the time, for a very short period, Amazon withdrew the ability for Australians to be able to buy goods out of their overseas stores. Now, once that system came in, and once quite clearly Amazon could see it wasn't getting the sort of traffic that it wanted, it basically overturned that completely. And so now, if you're an Australian, you can buy goods both from its Amazon store in Australia and overseas. So whether these threats are hollow or whether they are real, and Mark Zuckerberg wants to continue with them, we'll only really know, I think, once the legislation passes. But what you could hear today, particularly from Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, is they're pretty determined to make certain this legislation gets through intact.
This could very well backfire on Facebook, couldn't it? We don't need to go to Facebook for our news. It's just a habit. So I guess it's a bit of a culture change.
Well, do remember one important thing is that Microsoft backed the legislation and backed the government's moves in this. Part of the reason for that was because of the threats from Google initially, which clearly has overturned those threats now and has said it will comply and will pay Australian publishers and other media providers and creators money. But then also at the time, it was the Communications Minister again who had said, well, he'd already started using Microsoft's Bing web server and also had been using DuckDuckGo as an alternative. Now, where Australians go as an alternative to Instagram and Facebook, I'm not quite sure. That might be the big issue because many Australians, of course, use it for their social networking, for contact with family and friends. And I'm not certain there are that many alternatives to Facebook and to Instagram as compared with maybe, say, for example, Google and other search engines.
Well, skynews.com.au is a start to get your news indeed. It was interesting, Ross, to talk to Stephen Shearer. He's a former CEO of Facebook for Australia and New Zealand, and he essentially said, well, you know, there's questions about them interfering in our democratic processes here in Australia. And Ross, they're obviously concerned about contagion. So Australia is the test example. We're in many ways the guinea pigs because it doesn't want to see other countries follow suit with this media code, does it?
Well, that's precisely right. And indeed, remember that when the ACCC made this recommendation to have the legislation brought through, it was supposed to be a voluntary code. The government went one step further and made it a mandatory code and said there would be legislation to effectively force Facebook and Google to comply and to pay local publishers. Google, meantime, set up this Google Showcase. So around the world now, it's started to pay publishers, as it has here in Australia. Facebook hasn't done the same thing. And one of the keys here is also the algorithms, why you're higher up or lower down in the search when it comes up, or indeed higher or lower down the order of the listings you see when you go to Facebook. That's one of the keys here. And remember that as part of this mandated code that the ACCC can see through to some of those algorithms. And that's something quite clearly is very precious to Facebook and to Mark Zuckerberg, its founder. And so really I get a sense that maybe that really is where the negotiations and where it's seeking amendments to the legislation as it goes through the Australian Parliament, mainly because it does not want itself opened up in other parts of the world. And most important, I think, is Europe, which already has got some test cases out against it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Google last week was the boogeyman. This week it's looking like the exemplar and the best example. It's done deals, a flurry of deals in the last couple of days, including News Corp just in the last 24 hours. What can you tell us about that?
Well, those deals effectively mean that, as the government wants, as the ACCC wanted, that these organisations, big news organisations, will be paid for their content. And if you think about it, it makes common sense that if you get to the other side of it, if somebody's taking your content and then commercialising it by putting ads against it, then somebody should be actually paid for creating that content in the first place. It's not something you can just literally pinch and use and commercialise yourself. Now, what they have always argued is that they actually give more amplification, more audience to that piece of news. But the truth is that it's been generated by some organisation in the first place. It's paid for it. And so this is where the change has been. Google has always said, well, we didn't actually mind paying for that content, but what really had occurred was that under some sort of voluntary code, some sort of, if you like, agreement, there was never going to be a deal. And it was only when the government decided to go to legislation that you started to see the likes of the Googles change their mind about this. As I say, they're flexible, they've got the money, and the good thing is that there is money kept in Australia, given the fact that many of these big tech giants over a period of time have been criticised for not paying enough tax here in Australia.